Okay, so what I want to defend is a view I call the hybrid view, which is a middle way between the two now standard views, Neo-Lockeanism and Animalism, as we've been discussing it already. And the idea is that a plague on both your houses. We should actually go for a middle way, which we can call animalism if we like, or we can call a psychological continuity view if we like. We should rethink the debate and go for something in the middle. I call this view a middle way between the two now standard views. So let me first of all briefly describe the two standard views, very briefly, and I'll say a bit more later. Neo-Lockeanism then is the view that psychological continuity based on some kind of causal connectedness or link, maybe in some kind of non-branching form, these are all qualifications and elaborations that people put in, is necessary and sufficient for personal identity, and therefore necessary and sufficient for my continued persistence over time. Really, this is all about me. I think that's what we're talking about when we talk about personal identity. I'm talking about me, you're talking about you. What does a person mean in this debate? Well, the debate is really about me, and in your mouth it's about you. So, as Locke says, I is a name for this self. Self is synonymous with person. What we mean by person is simply what each of us refers to when he uses the word I. And that's what we get from Locke. Okay, so that's the Neo-Lockean view. Animalism, let me briefly explain this. Eric Olson has very illuminatingly distinguished between a weak animalist thesis and a strong animalist thesis. The weak animalist thesis is that we are animals. That's the statement. We are animals. The strong animalist thesis is that we are animals. That's one conjunct, and the second conjunct is psychology is irrelevant to the identity, the persistence conditions of the kind of animals we are. So it has two conjuncts. And it's strong animalism I'm going to be talking about. And when I say a plague on both your houses, the two houses are Neo-Lockeanism and strong animalism. Now, as you'll see, I've indicated there a divergence between views you can take if you're a hybrid theorist. I'll say more about this later. People know from the literature on the psychological continuity view, there are two ways you can go, basically. You can go the best candidate way, Shoemaker, think Shoemaker, or you can go the multiple occupancy way, think David Lewis. I think you've got the same divergence in the case of the hybrid view, and I go for Lewis. Okay? But now let me explain why, say a little bit more about this. I don't think this view is original, the hybrid view. In particular, I think you can find it in Rory Madden. I think you can also find it in Simon Langford in a paper he calls it disjunctivism, for obvious reasons. And I think something like it is in Murray Sheckman's work. But I think they don't distinguish carefully between these two versions, and insofar as they tend to argue for either any, they argue for the best candidate version. I think the correct view, if you're going to take this view, has to be the multiple occupancy version. So that's what I'm going to be defending, the multiple occupancy hybrid view. Okay, now Eric Olson actually, I think, attacks the hybrid view in the best candidate version. I think very convincingly attacks it. I think there are two places he attacks it. In the revised version of his paper, Was I Ever a Fetus, in the revised version, and also in a paper, whose name I forget, in the volume I'm in as well, where he distinguishes between, where he introduces the distinction between strong and weak. animalism. And I think what he said is very, very convincing. And that's why I was led to think about this and thinking we have to go the other way if we're going to be hybrid theorists. So, well, why take this middle way? Why take the hybrid view? You know, why, as it were, swing both ways? Well, I think the reason is that we have very strong intuitions supporting both positions, apparently. We have, and Paul Snowden's talked about this, other people have talked about this, the transplant intuition, which is obviously the first thing that the Neo-Lockeans offer in support of their position, and also, as people now distinguish, the remnant person problem. So that's what Neo-Lockeans say. They point to that kind of intuition. But then we have the fetus problem. Erica's engaged in a dispute with Linda Baker about this. The psychological continuity view appears to imply that I was never a fetus, I was sufficiently early fetus. It also seems to imply that I cannot enter into a permanent vegetative state. And really, we'd like to say all of these things. We'd like to say you go with your brain or your cerebrum, you were once a fetus, and you might end up in a permanent vegetative state. I might. I mean, this is all about me. That's why I think we should go the middle way. We should try to preserve all the intuitions we can. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about the transplant intuition, which of course is an argument in favour of it's put forward as an argument in favour of Neo-Lockeanism. What I want to emphasise about the transplant intuition is that it's got absolutely nothing to do with persons. It's not an intuition about persons. I mean, there's a recent paper by Shoemaker emphasises this. You can do this to your dog, and we have a very strong intuition that your dog goes where its brain or its cerebrum goes. It's just as strong as the intuition that I go where my brain or cerebrum goes. So it's nothing to do with people. It's to do with creatures with sufficiently interesting and complex psychology that can we distinguish between creatures of the same psychology. And as Shoemaker therefore says, he says, well, so dogs go where their cerebra go. This is the argument why we should accept psychological continuity as a sufficient condition for the persistence of a dog. But dogs are animals. Obviously in a perfectly good sense. And we are animals in the same sense as dogs. So Shoemaker says, I am an animal, a thinking animal, but I'm not an animalist, he says, because I do not accept that psychology is particularly relevant to personal identity. So he's a weak animalist in the sense in which I want to introduce that expression. Now for the against animalism, against the psychological continuity view. Against the psychological continuity view, we've got the fetus problem and the problem of people in permanent vegetative states. And the basic problem, I think, for the Neo-Lockean is this. According to any version of that view, you've got to say that the person came into it. If you're regarding the person as an individual thing whose persistence conditions are given in psychological terms, which is the traditional way, you've got to say that the person came into existence later than the animal, and in cases where permanent vegetative states ensue, the person ceased to exist before the animal. So the person has a life history which coincides with part of the life history of the animal. Persons are short-lived entities whose life history coincides typically with part of an animal's history. This won't always be so. There are people who just don't get into these unfortunate later stages. And science fictionally, I suppose we can imagine, you know, people coming into existence, you know, swan men coming into existence. But as a matter of fact, it's an implication of the psychological continuity view that I'm a short-lived entity, and I coincide with an entity which is longer lived than me. Whether you say that longer lived animal is thinking because it has what it takes, it's got everything I've got, or whether you say with Shoemaker, no, it isn't thinking, the animal with which the person coincides. And so he distinguishes the animal with which the person coincides from the animal the person is. So he said there are actually two animals here, in different senses of animal. An animal in the sense in which dogs are animals, and an animal in what he calls a technical, biological sense. Which of those you say is up for grabs, but you have got shorter-lived persons coinciding with longer-lived animals. Okay, and of course you've also got the remnant. Sorry, I should have mentioned when I was talking about the argument in favour of the neo-Lockean view, the remnant person problem, which seems to be a straightforward case to deal with. So your cerebrum is, on the way to being transplanted, is kept in a vat. There's surely some conscious being there. It looks like the neo-Lockean can say, yeah, that's me. The animalist can't say that's me, so the animalist has got to wriggle. Eric has done lots and lots of very sophisticated wriggling, but the neo-Lockean seems, on the face of it, to have the straightforward, simple answer. That's me. I've just been cut down a bit in size. There are things you can say either way. So it looks like we've got intuitions on both sides, and it'd be nice if we could set all the intuitions and go both ways. Well, what I would want to argue is that if you're a hybrid theorist, you can accept both sets of intuitions, because you can say what according to the neo-Lockean is sufficient for personal identity is sufficient, and what according to the animalist is sufficient is sufficient. Where these people go wrong is in what they say is necessary. You don't need the sort of psychological continuity the neo-Lockean says. It's unnecessary. So you can end up in the permanent registered state, and you were once a fetus. And you don't need the kind of biological, purely biological, non-psychological continuity the typical analyst says, because it's enough to have the right kind of psychological continuity, suitably caused, non-branching, etc. So you can accept the sufficient conditions, but reject the necessary conditions, and so you can get the best of both worlds. Okay, and that's the view that I take to be being defended, as I said, by the various people I mentioned, in particular, most explicitly and carefully, I think, set out by Rory Madden, though I think Simon Lanford's paper is, I don't know if people know it, is very good in this way as well, in setting out a very coherent account of this. Okay, so that's the basic theme. Now, so I want to accept both sets of intuitions, but now there's a question. If you're a hybrid theorist, you've got to think about what to say about cases. Since you're accepting sufficient conditions, you're accepting these as sufficient conditions, you've got to say what to say about a case in which, at a later stage, you've got one person who is connected to an earlier person by the psychological sufficient conditions, and there's a later person also connected to the earlier person by purely biological sufficient conditions. Well, we're very familiar with that debate. We're very familiar with the idea of fission of persons when we're talking about psychological continuity approaches, because we're very familiar with the idea that there can be two psychological continuities of what seems to be one original person. And people, so this has been debated, people take both views. Famously, the best candidate view, that you are the person who is the best candidate into psychological continuity, is defended by Shoemaker and also by Robert Nozick, who I think talks about the closest continua. And you can get lots of sophisticated versions of that, and I'm going to fall over this thing. And the other view, famously taken, is David Lewis's position, which is that in such a case, in which you've got two later people, psychologically continuous with what appears to be one earlier person, there wasn't one earlier person at all. There were two people all along who coincided and were thinking the same thoughts. And that view is taken by Lewis, is taken by Dennis Robinson, it's also taken by me, and I don't know anybody else. Now, this divide goes with a divide about a principle, a famous principle, defended by Bernard Williams, who I think calls it, actually, I think this is the name he actually gives the principle in a review of Robert Nozick. This is where I got it. I think he calls it the only X and Y principle. And it's the idea of this principle is very difficult to formulate. The idea roughly is that whether a later person is identical with an earlier person can't depend on what's going on elsewhere, can't depend on what happens with other people. It's very difficult to formulate that because you run into problems with the logic of identity. I've tried a formulation in my book on personal identity. I tried a formulation in terms of events. If two events are parts of the history of a single entity of a kind in one situation, then in any second situation in which all the events that are present in the history of that entity are also present, then those two events are also events in the history of a single entity. The idea is to capture this idea that what goes on elsewhere makes no difference, which is something that I think Williams appeals to in his famous Charles Robert Guy Fawkes case as an argument against some kind of psychological continuity view. Williams is, as Paul said, really wanted to argue. He's got a famous phrase, but our person's bodies. He wants people to physical things, their bodies. I actually think he's a lot closer to animalism than people maybe have given him credit to, because I think in that same paper he basically ticks off Strawson for ignoring the concept of an animal. I think if he was around today, he'd say, yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. Animalism is my view. Okay, so that's the principle. I could go into it in more detail. I think there's a better formulation of it. I think the best formulation of the thought behind that principle is actually captured in a paper by Robbie Williams, and he calls it the parting principality principle. That's better than anything I've managed, but that will take us perhaps into too many technicalities, and we need to leave time for discussion. Okay, so but the basic idea which lies behind the only X and Y principle, and why we have this divide between best candidate and multiple occupancy views, which I in the case of psychological continuity use, which I think can carry over to discussions of the hybrid view, is in the famous ship of Theseus. So you know the story. There's a ship which is undergoes replacement and repair parts. The parts are taken away and replaced. They're carefully stacked away by a plank holder, who later puts them together, makes a new ship made of the original planks. They're floating side by side. There are two ships, which is the original ship. Now, if you think about that complex situation in the middle, where those are the two ships, you can think of just repair and replacement of parts, and the replaced parts are just thrown away. Or you can think of a place that's simply of dismantling and reconstruction where plants are not replaced. And we tend to think in the first situation there, the unproblematic situation, you've got a sufficient condition for the persistence of a ship. In the third situation, you've got a sufficient condition for the persistence of the ship. What you say about the second situation, where it looks as if you've got two sufficient conditions satisfied, which is the ship. And you can say, one thing you can say is, well, you look for the best candidate. And most of us would say that the repaired ship is the best candidate in this situation. The other is a candidate, but not the best candidate. And so you go for a best candidate account. The other thing you can say, if you like the only X and Y principle, you can't say that because you've got to say the history represented by the line, the continuous line and the crosses, is present in both situations, and what's going on where the lines are, the broken lines are, is elsewhere, is irrelevant. So if you go for something like the X and Y principle, you've got to say, well, those two ships all along, it just didn't look like that. That's the Lewison view. So you've got that debate, and you carry it over to the more serious example of personal identity, and you get that debate. Okay, so you get that debate. Now, okay, so we've got two versions of the hybrid view, and I think Rory Maddon's version is a kind of best candidate version, and he uses a horticultural analogy to explain what's going on. He says, if you take the transplant place, we should compare this to plant cutting. But what happens when a cerebrum is transplanted? The cerebrum isn't to be compared to the cutting. The rest of the body is to be compared to the cutting. The cerebrum is the dominant plant, and the cerebrum, the plant that contains the cerebrum, is the dominant plant. You don't say the cerebrum. It's not that the person is a cerebrum. The person goes where the cerebrum is, and is momentarily constituted by a cerebrum and then by a larger body. And the whole body, the empty-headed, as it were, body left behind, is like the cutting. And so what you've got is a new, that cutting is a new existent. So you take a best candidate view. You say, in this case, the person goes with the psychology, with the cerebrum, and a new person comes into existence with a body without a psychology. And he also says that if you think about the final stage of the transplant, so you take, everyone's familiar with the Brown-Brownson. Brown is the brain donor, Robinson is the body donor. You take the final stage in which the brain is transplanted, or the cerebrum is transplanted into Robinson's body, into Robinson's skull. In that situation, what we've got to say is that this is like plant grafting, and the body donor is the graft, and it's an inferior plant, and therefore it ceases to exist. So if you go through, so Robinson, that person doesn't survive. He survives until the brain is put in, the cerebrum is put into his head. Then he ceases to exist because there's a dominant as Noonan would say, a closer predecessor. And so the person ceases to exist. So the crucial thing, he insists, is size doesn't matter. You might think the dominant thing, the best candidate, is going to be the bigger thing. But no, it's a matter of the most important capacities. When Paul has spoken about a bit about these notions of capacity. Now, I think he's absolutely right to say that the idea of retention of capacities is not a thing that should have a role in this account. Okay, so that's the view. If you take the best candidate view. Okay, so you've got things going out of existence, maybe not ways, coming into existence in maybe not ways, but you retain the intuitions. Okay, so I'll just unplug myself. Sorry. Do I plug myself back in? Okay, so if you don't do that, then you can take the multiple occupancy view, and as will be predictable, if you do that, you regard the brain transplant just as a special case of fission. You treat the fission as the multiple occupancy theorist treats fission. You've got to, and then you say before the fission. It turns out, and the fission here is the brain transplant leaving behind the empty body. Before the fission, there are two animals, one of which persists by psychological continuity, one of which persists by purely biological continuity. It's not that there are two kinds of animal, because a single animal can persist by psychological continuity and then by biological continuity, or the other way around. And then, I mean, you can chop and change. So there's a single kind of animal, and that's a contrast with Shoemaker's view, who insists there are two senses of animal. Okay, and you can think about this, as I said, you should think, if you're going to think about brain transplants, I think it's helpful to think of them in case of dogs first, because you get distractions if you think in case of persons, and the intuition is just as strong. So you say, well, there were all along two animals, i.e. two canine animals, one of which has persisted by psychological continuity, one has persisted by biological continuity. That's what you've got to say if you endorse the Untitled Why principle and go into a multiple occupancy view. May seem odd, but that's what you've got to say. It seems whatever you say, you've got to say something odd. Okay, if you now think about people, you bring in something extra, something more, something that isn't there in the dog case, namely the people are self-conscious. So people use the word I. So if there are two animals here, and they're both thinkers, the question is, which am I? That's the question the dog can't ask. But I can ask it. So you now get into worries about how the use of I, how the reference of I is determined, and what will we to say about that. And that's a debate that's gone on, it's gone on between me and Eric, if nobody else, in the context of the psychological continuity view. I just want to say briefly two things about this, because I need to get on to the other things. First of all, I want to say, I don't think, independently of this, I don't think you should say that the first person pronoun is guaranteed to refer to the thinker. And here I give credit to Paul Snowden, but I don't have the time to go into that now. So I think there are ways you can get around that complication. But I want to get on to the final things in the time I've got. So I talked about the final stage of the transplant in the ground case. If you're a hybrid view theorist and you take the best candidate view, and what Rory Madden says is, in this case, the body donor ceases to exist. The cerebrum transplant just travels, and that's who he is. The multiple occupancy theorist will, as you can expect, rather predictably say, well, look, we regard this as a case of fusion. We know how we speak about fission. We should speak in the same way about fusion. We've got multiple occupancy. Both the brain donor, the cerebral donor, and the body donor survive. They're now coincidence. They're now coincidence, non-identical coincidence. This is the story you get from Lewis. And notice I keep referring to Lewis. Lewis, of course, is a four-dimensionalist. Now, the point is that the argument driving you towards this position derives from a principle of Bernard Williams's. And the principle of Bernard Williams's maybe vague, maybe difficult to formulate, but it seems that there's a great deal of strength in that principle. And it's not at all obvious you need to be a four-dimensionalist to go along with Williams on that principle. So I don't see that this is necessary. I don't see you can say, oh, I'm not a four-dimensionalist, let's forget this. This can just be dismissed along with four-dimensionalism. You've got to say something about the only X and Y principle. Okay. Okay, so we've got lots of multiple occupancy going on if you accept the multiple occupancy view, which is sort of what you'd expect because it's called the multiple occupancy view. But there's one kind of multiple occupancy you don't have that on the psychological, neo-Lockean psychological view you do have. I'm not coincident with any distinct animal. I'm a thinking thing, I'm an animal, I'm not coincident with any distinct animal. Well, why not? Well, because, basically because I'm too old, which means that I'm not going to live long enough for brain transplants and things like that to happen. So these kind of things are not going to happen to me, and they haven't happened to me in the past. They haven't happened to any people of my generation, they haven't happened to any people of past generations. So the only kind of, I obviously was conceived, born and so on, and I may end up in a permanent vegetative state, who knows. But on the hybrid view, that doesn't mean that I'm not an animal. I am an animal who was in a fetal state, who may, let's hope not, end up in a permanent vegetative state, and is interestingly a thinking thing, but there's just one thing here. Now, what's the difference here between the objectionable kind of multiple occupancy, which the neo-Lockean is committed to, and and this kind of the kind of multiple occupancy which a hybrid theorist is committed to? Well, according to the neo-Lockean, there are two things here now. Here, there is the person who did not have a sufficiently early fetal stage. I am, according to the neo-Lockean, coincident with an animal which had a sufficiently early fetal stage. And so if we use this as a constitution, you can say Noonan is an animal which had an early fetal stage. But you can't say Noonan is predicatively an animal that had an early fetal stage. Okay? And ditto with the case of the permanent vegetative state. So the difference, now whether you say that the animal with which I'm coincident, according to the neo-Lockean view, is a thinker, I mean, it would seem that it is a thinker because it's got what it takes, it's got what I've got, and it's had what I've got for a long time and will have hopefully for a long time. So whether or not I end up in a permanent vegetative state, but it seems to have got a brain and everything necessary, so why isn't it a thinker? Shoemaker said, well, it's not a thinker because thinking is a thick property, and we have to distinguish between thick and thin properties. And so although he accepts that there are two coincident entities here, and he accepts that each of them is an animal in a sense, because I'm an animal in the sense in which a dog is an animal, and in that sense an animal can survive and will go with its cerebrum. He also thinks that there's a biological animal, which is coincident with me, and which came into existence before I did, and that is not a thinker in the sense in which I am, because I have the thick property of thinking, and this doesn't. Whether you say that or say that, well, there are two coincident things, and that it means there are two thinkers, you've still got, in this case, a shorter-lived person and a longer-lived animal, and they are coincident. And I mean, that seems to me to be, what seems to be objectionable about that is this. What's happened is that the animal has acquired certain properties. Since it's acquired certain properties, according to the Neo-Lockean view, you've got to say a person has come into existence. Something new, a person has come into existence. But what seems the correct thing to say is that the animal has acquired certain properties. And similarly later, if I fall into a previous state, according to the Neo-Lockean psychological view, you've got to say that a person, an individual thing, has ceased to exist, so an animal continues to exist. Well, it seems the correct thing to say is what's happened is a person has lost, an animal has lost certain properties. So I think it's a bit, what's wrong with the Neo-Lockean psychological view is that it's saying is that what it's saying about persons is what is transparently absurd if you think about teenagers. Suppose at a certain stage Kevin becomes a teenager. And Kevin is a thinking teenager. Okay? At a certain later stage, Kevin ceases to be a teenager. So Kevin is no longer a thinking teenager. Do we really want to say that just because of this change, something new has come into existence on Kevin's 13th birthday and goes out of existence on Kevin's 20th birthday? Do we really want to say that Kevin is a short-lived individual and there's a person who's a longer-lived individual with which he coincides? No. And I think that's the sort of picture you've got on the Neo-Lockean psychological view of the relationship between me and the animal here. A qualification here: if you are a four-dimensionalist, if you take the pejorative view, well, you will indeed say that something comes into existence when Kevin becomes a teenager and goes out of existence when Kevin is 20. He becomes 20. By the mere passage of time, things are coming into existence and going out of existence all the time. But the idea that the sort of changes. But if you don't take that view, you won't want to take that. But the Neo-Lockean has got to say that anyway. Shoemaker's got to say that. Shoemaker isn't a four-dimensionalist. He abhors four-dimensionalism. He loathes four-dimensionalism. But he's got to say there are two coincident things, one of them shorter lived than the other, and this came into existence just because the longer-lived person underwent certain psychological changes. And that's what seems to me distinctively objectionable to the about the Neo-Lockean view. So, to Eric's question, how many thinking things are there where you're standing, pointing to me? The answer is one, just one. That's what I think the hybrid theorists can say, given the history I in fact have. So I think the hybrid theorist, as far as I can see so far, is able to maybe taking the best candidate view, which is Riemann view, or accepting the most occupancy view, can capture the intuitions on both sides. Which way you should go, I don't know. I've been presenting both sides. But I think re-envisaging the debate in this way is the way forward. Okay?
Thank you very much.